Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're talking about Sylvia Plath and The Bell Jar, a book whose the public opinion has changed a lot on. I recently finished this novel about a couple days ago, and I'm here to talk about the author and how her life impacted this novel, the only novel she wrote, as well as my opinions on it. I do have a kind of like a take on what actually happens at the end of this book that I haven't heard yet on the internet. So I do believe I have something new to add to the conversation. And yeah, so let's begin. So you can see Sylvia here on the left, but Sylvia Plath grew up in Massachusetts. She grew up in Jamaica Plain. Her father was a professor at BU, or worked at BU, and her mother was a teacher as well. And she later then moved to Winthrop, which I believe is like more coastal in Massachusetts, and then eventually moving to Wellesley, Massachusetts. So this all takes place in Massachusetts, and she grew up relatively middle class until a traumatic event happens when she's 8 years old, which her father passes away. And that kind of is like the defining moment in Sylvia Plath's life. Up until that point, on paper, things were great. After that, nothing's ever the same. She famously says at her father's funeral that she will commit suicide to join him. Growing up, from that point on, her mother raised them, she and her brother, by themselves, and she was a single mother. So her mother tried her best to raise Sylvia and her brother, but of course they struggled financially. But Sylvia was a fantastic student. It's even reported that she might have been a genius of some sort with, high IQ and things of that nature. But she was excellent at school. She did great, and she always had great grades. And this might just seem like, a positive fact about a child just putting their head down and that's how they're dealing with loss, but actually it turned out to be something much deeper later in her life. Sylvia continues to get good grades for quite a while, but she feels immense pressure to do so. And not only that, because of the way her mother raised them, struggling to afford bills, she always saw her value in her success, in her grades while she was a student. And so there was a deep pressure and also insecurity when it came to it. Like, she had to get good grades. It wasn't just a matter of doing well in school for her. She continued to do so, and she eventually gets a scholarship to, I think it's called Smith College. And everything's going great. She gets a job at a magazine, working as an editor because she was a great writer. And this is kind of where the book takes place. The Bell Jar takes place. It starts off with this girl named Esther Greenwood, and almost everything in the book seems to parallel something in her own life. The book starts off with Esther Greenwood being an editor in New York, working for a magazine. And this is where I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening in this novel. I will say right now, okay, we've gotten into the book now. And we will get back into the author's life because it directly parallels the novel. But my personal opinion, okay, The Bell Jar is nothing to write home about. It's a simple novel in terms of its structure, which is not a bad thing, just describing it. It's a simple novel, and it tells a story that's quite sad and depressing, but you don't really understand how the character got there. You're following a girl in New York, kind of not really happy with the social life of a middle-class woman at the time. Like, she has friends, she's going out, and they're, drinking in sorts, and they're going to bars looking for boys. But you can immediately tell that the girl, she's interesting. I'm not saying anything, but she's interesting. She thinks in a different way, and that's, at the start, the interesting thing about the novel, is this girl thinks in an interesting way. She's quite misogynistic, and that's something that's mentioned today, but wasn't originally, or when it was championed as a feminist novel. She's quite misogynistic. Her views on men are they're interesting. It's nothing to be offended about, but it's interesting. Like, for example, she has like a disgust for short men, and she's like appalled by them even existing. It's kind of fascinating. And then, she's got friends, and she kind of doesn't like either of them, but she goes out with them, and she's struggling, and things are kind of not going well, unhappy. And this kind of parallels her life once again. In real life, she gets rejected from Harvard, and that kind of becomes like a big moment. In the novel, I'm actually not entirely sure, if I remember correctly, if that happens or if just something else happens, but we get to a point where our main character, our protagonist, is not doing well mentally. They return back home to Massachusetts, and things progressively get worse. She ends up doing a treatment that is electromagnetic something. I forget the name. And the doctors felt like it had gone well, but it treated the symptoms, but it didn't treat the root cause. This is because the reason why she goes into this clinic, I'm sorry, I forgot. It's a major part. She goes into the clinic, so things are not going well for her in New York, and she attempts suicide. And she takes a ridiculous amount of sleeping pills, and she goes to an abandoned part of a building or something. I forget what it was. She's found several days later and in not good condition. So she's taken to a mental hospital, eventually moved to a different facility in Massachusetts, where she's given this treatment that's electromagnetic. And they felt like it was going well. And it's around here that the novel ends, when she's leaving the treatment. But I have an interesting reading of this, especially towards the end. In my opinion, what actually happens at the end of the book is that, because throughout the novel she mentions her curiosity in assisted suicide. Okay, so the character is suicidal and depressed for large parts of the book, like Sylvia was in real life, right? But she consistently mentions in the novel a fascination with assisted suicide, and that there was this hospital that was actually doing assisted suicide. And in her dialogues while she's in the mental hospital in this book, she has conversations with another girl who eventually kills herself, and she wasn't very optimistic about life, about her getting better, about changing her life, not one bit. It seemed like she was pretty set on the fact that there was nothing to live for. And in the very end of the book, she talks in a verbiage of freedom, but a freedom much deeper than just leaving the hospital walls and once again having money, because you must remember, Sylvia had all the freedom that you would want in a modern society. She was middle class, making money, doing well, and she was in New York. One could say all the freedom, maybe that's not the freedom she meant. But to me, the language written in this novel is the language of somebody trying to escape physical reality. And you must remember, as a young girl, what she told her father when she was 8 years old. And her attempt in real life paralleling the attempt in the book, to me, it read like, when she was writing this novel, that there was still a desire to commit suicide, a fascination with death. And that's what it seems like to me is the reading on freedom, a much more darker understanding and usage of that word. So to me, the end of the novel is not her getting better and walking out of the clinic. It is instead her walking into the assisted suicide. Now, I could be wrong. That's just my take on it. I'm more than happy to discuss it in the comments. Interestingly, when she was writing the novel, Sylvia Plath, around the same time, I don't know if it was before or after, gets married to a British man, and she's living out in London, and the book is being published in London. And because of legal issues and fear of lawsuits, because the book was almost entirely autofiction, the publisher did not want to include her real name. They wanted to publish it under an alias, because the coverings of the people in her real life were very loose. She changed a couple of names, but all of the events were exactly the same as they happened in real life. So there was a danger of getting lawsuits for defamation and all sorts of things, right? And so the publisher said, listen, we're not taking the risk of publishing this under your real name. It's too risky. And so they pressured her to publish it under the name Victoria Lucas. And she was deeply saddened by this. And it actually made her more depressed, because she thought that the book would give her a freedom, right? That publishing it under her real name would get her the claim that she believed she deserved, and it would be tied to her real life, so people would understand that it was autofictional. The events would be carried with a lot more weight. It wouldn't just be somebody doing, a psychological novel about a woman that's depressed. It was real life and something to be taken seriously. And so the book gets published anonymously, and unfortunately, it does not receive much critical acclaim or attention at all. There were a few magazines that did review the novel, and they said it was witty, that it was well written, yeah, and that's kind of as far as it went. It was kind of went under the radar. She gets divorced from her husband because of infidelity, her husband's infidelity, and she actually later does commit suicide. Unfortunately, rest in peace. That isn't when the book takes its turn. It takes actually for the second wave of feminism movement to happen in the United States, for this novel to become adopted the by this movement, by the second wave of feminism. And this becomes a and they kind of take the novel, in my opinion, and run away with it and make something out of it that it was not. But it fit the agenda. So this book becomes like this rite of passage book for young women, where they have to read this book. It is a part of the curriculum to be a second wave feminist. And this book kind of becomes a symbol to be against the patriarchy and also the unspoken problem. I'm putting quotations because that's not my phrase. Unspoken problem is a second wave feminist phrase. The unspoken problem, which is documented in this book, which is Esther's problems in her life that she couldn't exactly put words to. And so this book becomes massive. And then the book's ultimately transformed. It's published in the United States before it becomes a feminist novel. It's published in the United States under her real name. And that's part of it, because now they could tie it to her real life and see that this book almost became a confession of what she would later do to herself, but also what caused her to do that and how society played a fact and how that was attributed by second wave feminism to the patriarchy. The paradoxical situation this book stands in today, where it's considered a high work of feminist literature, but then it's like, oh no, it's racist at the same time. I think that's interesting. But honestly, yeah, there is definitely some offensive remarks when it comes to especially Asian and I think Puerto Ricans in this book, but it is what it is. Especially works written in the 1930s. A lot of times it's just a part of novels written from that time period. Yeah, it's not great, but it's there. So, but additionally, the thing I wanted to talk about, other than my take that she walks into assisted suicide, is that I didn't think this book was that feminist. At least not the way it was taken and adopted by the movement. I can see its complaints about how society was run, but it didn't seem like it was just about the patriarchy and the fact that men being charged is the problem. It seemed like Sylvia was much less interested in that than she was in just simply documenting her mental state. And that to me seems like the entire point of the book. This bell jar that she felt that she was stuck in and she couldn't breathe. And it didn't seem like she was necessarily putting the blame, at least to me, on anybody else other than, I mean, there is certainly the way it's written some blame on her mother and the actual doctor and the health system itself. If anything, it's definitely a critique of that, of how she was treated, like she was absolutely nut job insane, even though she wasn't. She just wasn't happy with life. And that might sound contradictory, but it's not. And when you read the book, you can see that. This is a highly intelligent person, and that came off through the character and the writing. You could tell that the character and both the author, they were smart. They're not dumb. They're not here because they're like you have to do everything for them and they're completely incompetent. That's not why she was harmful to herself. She simply did not want to live. And I think that is a reality that perhaps she was trying to draw attention to, because at this point she obviously hadn't committed suicide yet and she wouldn't for a couple of, or several years. But the psychology the character was undergoing and the stress she did feel. And that to me seems to be what this book does extremely well. This is basically, I saw this comparison by a critic that this book is very similar to J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. And I actually, for the first time when hearing a comparison about two works of literature, completely agree. Esther Greenwood is Holden Caulfield if he was way more depressed and a girl. It's very similar in the sense that they're both written very well. They're simple in their writing, but it's effective. And you're interested in the character and you turn the page. Now, this is not a book I loved. I'll just be, as a story. not talking about its impact, its how personal it is, how real it is, how honest it is, the fact that it happened in real life to Sylvia Plath, excluding those things. Simply talking about this book as a novel. To me, it wasn't amazing. It wasn't one of the best things I read. It's simply a good book. I couldn't necessarily recommend it to a friend because to me, there's a bunch of other things I would rather read that I would recommend first. But just wanted to talk about it, give my take on the ending, as well as my opinions on how it was misproperly adopted. I mean, I think it was conveniently adopted because it fit the agenda, but I don't actually think Sylvia Plath was writing about the same issues that second wave feminism was addressing. That's essentially my thesis to that. Yeah, and I'm currently reading Clockwork Orange, another American classic. Very interesting and bizarre book. I love the creation of a vocabulary for a dystopian future. It's cool so far. Not too far in, but we'll do a review of that when I'm done. See y'all.